In this session, I wanted to recap the process for uploading the source archive and the executable archive for submission for our classes. This will be similar, but maybe not the same as for your other classes. Here we're dealing with blueprint projects, and you're going to submit a source archive and an executable archive. As well, some of the assignments may have additional requirements, such as an attribution list or source assets, the FBX or OBJ files, the material files or audio files. There may be other requirements. But when it comes to creating and sharing the source archive and the executable archive for grading, those files are quite often very large and become cumbersome to move around, are giving a little bit of challenge sharing those for grading. Let's talk a bit about the processes. I'll flip you over to the presentation screen here. So we have our sample project. We're going to do a file save all just to make sure that all of the assets are saved and updated. If we look at our outline here, so we're going to talk about creating the source archive and the executable archive and then sharing them out. When you share those with me, you're either going to share them, probably the preferred method, if you're in one of the programming courses and you're already using Azure DevOps, would just be to create a DevOps project and then share it in that capacity. Short of that, using the college OneDrive is probably the next best alternative, with the caveat that you're using the web interface. You're not using the virus that is the web OneDrive client that Windows installs on your computer. That's just going to cause you use the web interface to upload and or download to your college OneDrive account. Probably going to be a good second alternative if you're not using DevOps, or be the preferred method using DevOps. DevOps first if you're already using it. Otherwise, try OneDrive via the web interface, not via the client. The college OneDrive, not your personal OneDrive, because the OneDrive attached to your college email address has a terabyte of storage on it, so we won't have any storage issues or restrictions. Whether you're using DevOps, OneDrive, or Google Drive, you need to make sure that the instructor has read access to this. You could explicitly assign the instructor, in this case me, read access to that folder, or for a temporary period of time, make it publicly available. And then once the assignment's been collected and graded, you could re-hide it or remove it so that it wasn't publicly viewed if you didn't want. That leads us to our third option, which is Google Drive. I say use this at your own risk. There are some challenges with it. If you're just doing a file share, I would strongly recommend OneDrive via the web interface and your college email. A fourth alternative would be GitHub, with the caveat that it's only good for sharing the source, and that you would share the source through a version control process and not through this archived file structure. So a couple of caveats there. Challenge with GitHub is that it is limited in file size, and several of the files within the Unreal Engine project environment would exceed the file size limitation on the. So how do we create an archive for the source of your project and for the executable? So we've talked about this quite a number of times. We're just going to recap it though. With our project open, it's not running. We're in the editor here. We're going to do a save all to make sure everything's up to date. And then we're simply going to go file, zip project. It's going to default to the current project folder. We'll add a _src for source _ and then a date coded timestamp. So in this case, 2025-03-1401, representing the first version of the file, the 14th day of March 20. Save this, and it's going to go ahead and create an archive file for us, and it's going to contain the main project file, the .u project file, the config directory, and the content folder. And you heard the little chirp or zip. You see the green flash behind me that just disappeared. It means that archive is created. We're going to bring up the project directory here. With the project directory open, we can see we have this new file in the folder here based on our project name underscore src for source underscore and the date code. And it's 250-ish. So that's all the necessary components I recreate the project. That's our source archive. If you were packaging for Windows to create the executable, you would simply go Platform, Windows, Package Project. It's going to default to offering us the current directory, folder, current projects folder. So I'll say select folder. It's going to go away and create the archive. I will pause it for this. This will take a moment or two longer. When it's done, we'll come back. Okay, so we have the green flash here. The project has packaged fine. You can see here we've got the successful build indicator in our log. I'm going to bring up the local file directory, and here we now have this Windows folder. And in this Windows folder is the executable version of our program, our game. All of these components are required to make this game run. So if you wanted to move this to another computer that didn't have Unreal on it and wanted to run it, so you wanted to send it to like your parents' computer, something like that, you would have to take all of these files, move these files to it. The game would run on that computer. So to submit that as your executable archive, we're simply going to right-click on it. In my case, I've got 7-zip installed here. And with 7-zip, I've got the option add to windows.zip. So it's going to go away and compress that whole folder into a file called the windows.zip here. Now, if you had a different zip or RAR utility installed here, the presentation of how you create that may appear a little bit differently, but basically you would right-click on it and say, create a zip out of this folder, and it's going to follow this process and package up all of those pieces. So with the archive nearing finish here, we now have this compressed folder as windows.zip. I'm just going to highlight it, and either I can right-click on it or click and pause. If I right-click and say rename, it'll bring this up, or if I click and hold, it'll give me the option to here, and I'm going to name it the same as the other one, or similar to the other one. So BR mod 09 test trace underscore, and this time exe instead of source, because this is the executable archive, and then date code again 1401. So now I've got the source code that we use the file zip process inside Unreal to create the source archive. We packaged the game, right-clicked on the packaged game, and chose to add it to a zip file. I created the executable version. Now, if, as in some of our, as we do in some of our classes, we're actually targeting something other than Windows. We're targeting an Android platform for our VR headsets. You'd, of course, submit a packaged Android version, so Android package project. Work of my setup, I get this little flash. I'm going to tell it to continue. I've now been offered the location to create the default folder. I'm going to accept to create it inside the project folder. It's going to go away and create the Android or VR headset version of this. I'll pause the recording. We'll come back when it's done. Okay, so we have our successful Android build here. And if we look in our folder, we now have this Android ASTC. So instead of packaging, if you're packaging in the case of our VR class, packaging, you would package for Android, and then you would follow the same steps here. You would right-click on the Android ASTC folder, say compress to Android.zip. So it's going to create a new zip file with a new name. So one was Windows if we're packaging for Windows, the other was if we're packaging, or this one is if we're packaging for Android. You wouldn't likely do both. So again, I'm going to rename this so that it's more clearly my source code. So VR mod 09 trace. Again, this is an executable and it's an Android APK, so I could say exe or I could call it APK. I just indicate that it's the Android executable. Say 2025.03.14.01.zip. So this would be my Android packaged version of this particular application. Then I would take, in case of our Android or our VR course, I would take these two files and submit them. Or if this was for one of the other classes where we're using Windows executables, I would take those to share or submit those. So hopefully that this helps streamline the process for you a little bit. It'll certainly make the files easier to manage when you're sharing them up to me and can reduce the total amount of data that you have to share out. So these are the files that would be shared on the OneDrive or if you had to Google Drive. If you were using DevOPS, you would just share the whole folder that contains all of this in a control process. Thanks.